Good morning. Welcome to the Trent England Show, coming to you live on Facebook at the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs Facebook page and over on our YouTube channel as well. And, of course, we're also on the Trent England Show page where I will post all the links that we talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit about happiness today and tomorrow. I know I've been plugging this all week. There is some new research out from the center-left Brookings Institute about happiness, and I think it's blowing their mind. We can understand it and explain it better than they can because we're conservatives and we're grounded in human nature and history, and that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk a little bit about happiness. What makes people happy? If you missed yesterday's show, be sure to go and catch yesterday's show. It's in the archive, YouTube, Facebook, or over at ocpathink.org. That's where the entire show archive, the old radio show archive, lives over there at ocpathink.org, and you can catch yesterday's State of the Union wrap-up. We had clips of the president and Joe Kennedy and the whole deal. So if you missed that, be sure to catch that in our show archives. You can also follow us or you can subscribe on iTunes. So we're in the iTunes space as well. We're also going to talk today about higher education. I've got the latest national insanity, or at least insanity coming from, thankfully, another state. We talked about some of the insanity here locally earlier this week, but the latest insanity going on nationally, and also some local floundering, actually ties in with this research on happiness, interestingly enough. But it's in the paper this morning, Task Force on Higher Education. I've got it here. And the latest floundering around trying to figure out how to micromanage other people's lives from the ivory tower of politics and bureaucracy. We'll bring that to you. Don't forget, Monday is the State of the State address, Governor Mary Fallon's last State of the State address, and also the opening day of the Oklahoma legislative session. So we will have a special show kind of kicking off the legislative session on Monday morning at the same time we always do, 9 a.m., just like it is this morning. And then we will have live coverage of the State of the State address at noon on Monday. So you won't want to miss that at noon on Monday. If you were going to watch the State of the State address, what better way than to watch it with me live right here? And if you weren't going to watch it, we're going to make State of the State addresses great again by providing some running commentary on what the governor has to say on Monday during lunchtime. You won't want to miss it. So happiness. Happiness, what does that mean? You know, I got into a little debate with somebody when I was back in Washington, D.C. last week, a kind of a conservative-minded fellow who wanted to talk with me about the Constitution, and we got to talking about the American founding, and he said, well, happiness is subjective. And I pushed back on that a little bit. I don't know that that's actually true. The research suggests, when we talk about happiness in a sort of a lighthearted way, what makes you happy in the sense that what makes me sort of feel good in the moment, right? Obviously, those things are subjective. They relate to our tastes. But when you dig a little deeper and you talk about what makes a person really happy, right? What makes a person happy where that happiness transcends the circumstances of their moment? That's a different thing. And both the social science research suggests and all of, I think, Christian theology and classical philosophy suggests that it's not subjective, it's objective. And the latest research from the Brookings Institute actually underlines that concept in a way that, as I say, I think it's blowing their minds on the left. Actually, I think they kind of popped this out there as a news story last week. Hey, look, we got some research, and then it's just sort of, well, nobody wants to touch it because nobody's sure what to do with it. Let's pull up the title page of that report. People can see this. The study is Unequal Hopes and Lives in the U.S., Optimism or Lack Thereof, Race, and Premature Mortality. And of course, being unhappy tends to lead to an earlier death. We really try to get these things right on the show, unlike so much of the rest of the media. Tends to, right, on average, lead to an earlier death, being less happy. And if you just look at the title page here, you might think they're gonna show standard left-wing line, whatever it is. Minorities, women, children, the poor, hardest hit, right? That's the standard left-wing line about anything, right? Is that whatever's going on in America, there's some racial element in it, and minorities are maybe unintentionally, but probably intentionally, somehow getting the short end of the stick in America. I mean, that's I don't think that's controversial to say. That's kind of the standard left-wing story about everything that they talk about, except if you read into this report here, here's what I'm going to show you some charts in just a minute. I'm going to show you some maps of happiness in the United States from this report from the left. But you just go to the little abstract here in this report, and what do they say? I'll just read it to you here. African Americans are by far the most optimistic, while whites and Asian Americans are the least optimistic, and these differences are largest among low-income groups. That is fascinating. The next sentence says this: when adding a rural-urban dimension, we found that poor rural whites are the least hopeful among the poor. African Americans and Hispanics also display higher life satisfaction and lower stress than do poor whites. And it goes on and on and on. I mean, basically, the two things here, and these things overlay each other. One is that minorities, the minorities typically talked about as minorities, right? They take, this is just, again, this is coming from the left. So this is how they do all their social science on the left, right? You've got whites and Asians over here. You've got blacks and Hispanics over here. And again, this is research from the left. I don't know. I avoid slicing and dicing Americans by what they look like as much as I possibly can, but on the left, they do it as much as they possibly can. And so they take whites and Asians over here, they take blacks and Hispanics over here, and it turns out that the blacks and Hispanics tend to be happier. In this, again, this is Brookings Institute research, 100-year-old, $100 million center-left think tank in Washington, D.C. They have no idea what to do with their findings here, but to their credit, they did publish them. And at least some poor Americans, particularly among minority groups, tend to be happier than their wealthier counterparts. And these two things overlay to produce the fact that actually it is poorer African Americans who are, on average, it's all averages, right? On average, the happiest Americans, and it goes even further than that. Let's take a look at a couple of these charts. First, we have poor non-Hispanic whites. That means people who are white, who aren't Hispanic. I could go on and on about the craziness of left-wing social science, but I won't do that because we're looking at what they found here. This is, so the darker green indicates more happiness, and the lighter green indicates less happiness here. And what do we find? Now, one thing you might look at this and say, I'm going to look at this and say, people seem to like the sun. California, Texas, and Florida do very well here, as does Nevada, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, and also Maryland. Again, this is looking just at people who are white and poor. And interesting. Okay, so we could delve into this. I think one of the things that's interesting is a lot of these states aren't that different from each other. That come out with very different results here. We'll talk more about this maybe on the show tomorrow. But let's go to the next chart, which is they call it pooled. They call it poor minorities, pooled black and Hispanic. So these are people who are black or Hispanic and also poor. The geography of their happiness in the United States of America, according to the Brookings Institute. And what do they find? What states do really well? I mean, this is counterintuitive, especially if you're a leftist, but maybe counterintuitive for everybody. What states do the best? The South. South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee. The only state other than those 6 southern states that does really well here is Michigan. What states do really, really poorly? 2 of them I've lived in before. California looks terrible. Oregon, Washington State, abysmal. also Colorado, also New Mexico, also Kansas, interestingly enough. Oklahoma does much better than Kansas and a little bit better even than Texas in this regard. Iowa does not look very good here, although Missouri, Arkansas do about as well as Oklahoma. I mean, what? Okay, let's just. I don't want to get too far into the weeds here. I do want to talk a little bit about what this means. And again, we're going to come back to this again tomorrow. I didn't want to spend an entire show just on one research study, as mind-blowing as it is for some people. But look, what possibly could explain this? What could explain the fact that some of the happiest... Well, let's talk first about what does this show is not true, right? This shows that this book, I don't know, can you see it there? This is my volume of Marx. You know, you've got to have Das Kapital by Karl Marx, right? Laying around the broadcast studio. The materialist story, right? This is the real materialists in America are liberals, are leftists, right? They're the people who say the whole is not greater than the sum of its parts. All you are is a bunch of guts, right? All human beings are is a bunch of guts and the stuff that you own. And that's why they get all wrapped around the axle about inequality. And look, some kinds of inequality that is perpetrated by politicians, that is perpetrated and perpetuated by elites using government to keep themselves up in a way that keeps other people down, the kind of inequality that you see in places like San Francisco and in places like Washington, D.C., that is at least perpetuated by, if not perpetrated by politicians. That kind of inequality is a big problem, and I'll make common cause with the left if they ever get serious about it. They're never serious about it. They run those places, and they like to talk about inequality in other places where it is much less a result of politics and just a result of the fact that life isn't fair. The fact is that people come from different backgrounds, people do different things, and there are poor people, poor artists, and people who are poor through no fault of their own, who this study shows are actually very happy, right? And so the story that it's all material stuff, right? The progressive leftist story, which comes, I'm not saying anybody's a Marxist, but I am saying that the foundation of those ideas goes back to people like Karl Marx, and it really goes back specifically to Karl Marx, right? That strain of ideas is just dead flat wrong, and it's destructively wrong, right? Because when you look at this map, one of the things that jumps out about this map here is, it is imperfectly, but it is almost a heat map of religiosity in the United States. Right? One of the things that we know about these states where people tend to be happy regardless of the fact that they have less stuff, and regardless of the fact that they have, look, let's not gild the lily here, right? Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, right? Poor Americans who are black, who live in those states, almost invariably have ancestors who were actually enslaved because of their race. And after they were freed, they were systematically and in some cases violently discriminated against by the political systems in those states for 100 years, right? I mean, if anybody has an excuse to be unhappy, it's those people living in those states, right? The people the Brookings Institute here has isolated, studied, looked at in those states, right? They have a very legitimate gripe. And some, certainly there are lingering effects of that. There's no doubt that that's true, right? But for some reason, they're actually more happy with their lives than people who are, visually similar and similar as far as material resources and backgrounds, who live in places like California, Washington State, places run by the progressive left, places where, there is not the same history of discrimination. One of the things interesting about California, too, is, California has had a lot of discrimination against Asian Americans, right? But not as much, right, against Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, and yet Black Americans, Hispanic Americans living in California are far less happy. And just superficially, just scratching the surface here, a part of the answer has got to be what people believe about their religious faith, what people's religious faith actually is, right? One of the things that when you look at this chart is places where people tend to be happy, and the groups of people who tend to be happy tend to be some of the most religious Americans, right? And this is something, I will say, to their credit, there have been social scientists on the left who have pointed out, who will say things like this, and Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin frankly said things sort of like this, right? I don't necessarily believe in this. This is what they would say. I'm not saying this. This is what they would say, right? I don't necessarily believe in this stuff, but if you're serious about the social science, you can see that people are actually more happy when they have faith, when they have hope that comes from religious faith. It's not just about stuff. This study is actually really important, and we're gonna unpack some more of this tomorrow, and I'm gonna keep going back to this on the show, going back to this in things that I write, because look, we've got to get back to what it says in the Declaration of Independence, right? What are the rights that we have? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And if you go back and you study the Declaration of Independence, that happiness did not mean feeling good. It didn't mean material stuff, right? Which is one of the reasons, probably, we don't know for sure, but probably one of the reasons why Thomas Jefferson did not use the formulation that was more common at the time, life, liberty, property. He didn't say property, he said pursuit of happiness. There are two theories on why that is, but one of them is that, look, ultimately, it's only worth having property if you can use it to pursue happiness, and they understood happiness to mean something other than just having lots of stuff or feeling good in the moment. They understood happiness to mean actually living a good life in accord with principles that don't change over time, which is to say, a kind of happiness that's actually objectively true, and research like this shows that kind of happiness exists, because it shows that people can suffer serious discrimination. Have at least their ancestors intensely and violently and vilely discriminated against, and be poor in the moment right now today, and still be the happiest Americans in the entire country, right? If that doesn't blow up a lot of the claims of the materialist left, I don't know what does, but I think it does. So, okay, let's leave that for today. Again, we'll come back to that tomorrow. I'll post the links to that in the show show comments. I usually drop some links in the comments once the show goes into archive mode on YouTube and on Facebook, and I'll put these up with a few more thoughts from me over at the Trent England Show Facebook page as well. But let's jump over into the world of higher education, and these things are connected, because one of the things we have here, and I'll just hold it up because this is what I've got. Task force sends higher ed ideas to state regents. This is in the Oklahoman this morning, and it is, look, well-meaning people. I'm not smacking anybody who's quoted in the article or anybody who's doing this work. I have no doubt they all mean the best for the future of Oklahoma, but they have fallen prey to two conceits, right? Well, maybe three, but at least two conceits. One is this idea that it's all about money, right? Which, again, this research shows it's not all about money, and every parent knows. If you ask a parent, would you rather your kid be rich or happy? Good parents say, I'd rather they be happy. I'd like them to be rich so they can take care of me in my old age, but I want them to be happy, right? And that's what we want, right? We oftentimes fall prey to the idea that if I just had a little bit more stuff, I'd be happier. The research shows that's not true, not just this research here, but a lot of research shows that is not actually true. And most people, when pushed, will say I kind of know that's not actually true. It just seems like life would be less stressful, which is, I suppose, maybe true if we could ever get more money and then not spend it all. But we tend to be like the politicians. The politicians are like politicians. They always spend all the money because they're human beings, and they fall prey to the same human nature that we do. One of the things this task force is all obsessed about is money and earnings and how much people earn. And look, when people involved in higher ed get all focused on that, it should concern us all, because they have very little control over it, right? And this is the problem in politics. Is one of the conceits in politics is that politicians tend to think, actually, again, this is back to human nature. This can happen to any of us, outside of government, outside of politics, but it's more dangerous in politics because they control other people's lives. And the problem is, the conceit is that they think that when they can measure something, they can change it. Because they can measure something, they can change it. If you can measure happiness, you can change it. If you can measure how much money people are making when they're 5 years out of college, then you can change it. And that's not true. It's just not true. And politicians will sort of flout their good intentions, right, by talking about how they want Oklahomans to be better off. And if you just give them more power, then surely they can make Oklahomans wealthier, and they don't have the power to do it. And it's not really the highest and best thing anyway. is just making more money. You know what they could control and what they don't talk about here? They could control how much people spend on school. They could get serious about making higher education in Oklahoma as efficient as it could possibly be. The other thing they're concerned about is graduates leaving the state, especially STEM graduates. You know, science, technology, engineering, and math. They say a lot of these people leave the state. Well, the funny thing is, we get told two things, usually not in the same article because it would be awkward. One is we don't have enough STEM graduates. The other is we have plenty of STEM graduates, so many in fact, that most of them, not most of them, but that nearly half of them leave the state, leave Oklahoma and go work somewhere else, right? That tells us something, right? If half of Oklahoma's STEM graduates leave the state and go somewhere else, it tells us that they're finding higher paid jobs somewhere else, that apparently there are not a bunch of great STEM jobs that we need STEM training for here in Oklahoma. And one of the reasons, I speculate, I admit here that I speculate, but one of the problems people have when they get out of college, here's a free college tip, a free higher ed tip from Trent, not for the politicians, but for parents and for students out there. I talk to people, anytime I hear anybody's considering law school, I have this talk with them. I sit them down and I say, look, I want to talk to you about law school for just a minute, because the problem that people have with law school, but it's the same at community colleges, the same at four-year colleges. The problem people have is they think, I want to go there and I'm going to get a degree, I'm going to graduate, I'm going to go do something I love to do. You know, I'm going to go into public service, or I'm going to go do whatever. A lot of lawyers, you know, they want to go and they want to do pro bono legal work, or, you know, they want to litigate constitutional issues. And they get close to the end of law school. They get into the beginning of their last year, and they realize, I have so much debt that unless I make a ton of money, I'm going to be up to my ears in debt for the rest of my life. And, you know, this may just not be worth it, right? I might not really not be able to not just take the highest paying job. And so I speculate there. So that's Trent's little college talk. I mean, the amount of debt that people takes on, exactly what it says in the Bible, right? Debt deprives you of freedom. Debt deprives you of choices. It limits the choices you have on the other end. And the more we can help our new college students, right, in community college and law and whatever it is, STEM students understand that, the better off they will be 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 or 8 or whatever years down the road. And I speculate that for STEM graduates, one of the things that would help them to stay is not a new government study, is not politicians giving speeches. It's making their STEM degrees cheaper so that they can actually get the benefit of living in low cost of living Oklahoma, because if they have the same amount of loans that they would get from graduating from a coastal university, right? If they've got the same payments that they would have having graduated from a coastal university, they might as well go to the coast and make more money, even though the cost of living is higher, right? I mean, one of the ways to keep Oklahoma graduates in Oklahoma is to drive down the amount of money that they have to spend to get their degrees so that they have more freedom when they graduate, freedom to stay and live in low cost of living Oklahoma, right? So that's what they should be talking about. But instead, they're floundering around with things that are important, but things that are hard for politicians to control. And I will tell you this, politicians love to talk about things that are hard for them to control because it maximizes the relative importance of them espousing their good intentions and minimizes the importance of results, because they can always turn around and say, well, I did everything I could. I mean, I gave lots of speeches. I created a study group. There may be a blue ribbon commission. I did everything I possibly could, and these darn individuals keep making individual choices for themselves, and it's messing up my statistics, right? That's what the politicians say. Okay, the latest national craziness in higher education. Let's bounce over to that. Great story over at the Federalist. This is Margot Cleveland writing at thefederalist.com. 10 crazy things inside the lawsuit against Marquette University for firing Professor John McAdams over freedom of speech. I'll sketch this out. If you haven't seen this, I'll just sketch this out for you. This shows how crazy it is in higher education, although there's a silver lining to this story. There is a silver lining to this story here. But Professor John McAdams, a tenured professor at Marquette University, had a student come to him and say, look, I was in my philosophy class, and the instructor in the philosophy class happened to be a graduate student instructor, right? But this is the kind of shenanigans they play in higher education. They say, oh, come to our school. We've got great professors. Well, they're not actually going to teach you. We're going to have these graduate students teach you. But we have great professors. But Marquette University has this graduate student teaching a philosophy class, and the instructor brings up a bunch of current topics, current issues, including so-called homosexual marriage, right? The idea that people of the same gender can marry each other. I know, isn't that weird? So the instructor brings this up among a list of other things that they're going to talk about in the class. But then she says this. She says, but of course, we're not going to talk about this because this debate is settled. And the student went to her afterward and said, I don't think that's right. I mean, I have a different view than you have, and are you telling me I can't just honestly express my views in your class? And the instructor said, no, you are forbidden to express your views in my class. Other students can express their views if they agree with me, the professor, the instructor, but you can't express your views because you're a Christian, conservative. You can't express your views because you agree with Barack Obama before he was running for re-election as president of the United States. Actually, I mean, this student probably has even more sensible views than that, right? But it's good to remind people. I mean, you know, every political figure who's over 40 years old basically started out with a position that now is considered by the totalitarian fascist left to be a position that is considered, you know, it dare not speak its name. So the student goes to Professor McAdams and says, "Look, this is what happened to me. I've made a complaint with I brought this to the attention of the dean. They basically told the student to go jump in a lake, so Professor McAdams wrote a blog post about this. He wrote about this on his personal blog and described what happened at the school, and he is being punished." They tried to fire him, they've suspended him, and so he's suing the school for breach of contract. He's a tenured professor. His contract with the school says that he has freedom of speech, academic freedom, that he has a right to engage in even activism, even, you know, talking about controversial subjects. This is explicitly a part of his contract as a tenured professor at Marquette University, and they're trying to fire him because he stood up for a conservative student who was being muzzled, explicitly muzzled. There are no factual questions here. This student was being muzzled in this class by a professor, and now that Professor McAdams' lawsuit has gone through the discovery process, we now know that the instructor, the dean, right, the leftist fascists at Marquette University, not just the graduate student instructor, but the fascist dean at Marquette University, the people in the administration running the university, we're actually sending emails back and forth calling Professor McAdams all kinds of nasty names. Here, I'll give you a couple of these here. It really is outrageous. Let's see. There we go. They called McAdams a bigoted moron. They called him creepy. They called him a flaming bigot. They called him an idiot, and they said he had an ugly face. That was from the instructor there who was muzzling the student. The dean, the chair, of the philosophy department called him a right-wing lunatic. And they also were ridiculing the student, right? This young undergraduate student who just wanted to be able to have freedom of speech in his class, in his philosophy class, to talk about ideas in a philosophy class. They called him a jackass, a little twit, a little twerp, an insolent little twerp. They can't even spell at Marquette University, at least in the administration. Okay, what's the silver lining? The silver lining is this is a private university. If they want to be crazy, ultimately, at the end of the day, they can be crazy. They signed a contract with Professor McAdams. I think he's going to win this lawsuit. I think he's probably going to win damages from the university. But that's all the recourse. It's a private, supposedly Catholic university. And so look, if they want to be bigots, if they want to be fascist, if they want to take the position that we teach philosophy by telling people what to think, and discussions and disagreement are forbidden. I understand. Some people take that point of view. It's not really education. It's fake education. It's not liberalism. It's straight up fascism. It's intellectual fascism. That's what it is. We're going to call it by name, but they can do it in a private university. You know where they can't do it? In a public university. right? And when we see this, and we talked about this idea cropping up at OSU, when we see it there, it is not okay. And we should draw a distinction. As conservatives, we should draw a distinction. Private university wants to be crazy, wants to be fascist. It's a free country, right? But when we see these things crop up in public universities, we have got to put our foot down. And so that is the latest craziness, insanity out there in higher education nationally. Tomorrow, I'm going to tell you, I got to wrap it up for the morning, but tomorrow I will tell you about remember I mentioned, I think on, I don't know, was it Monday, was it Tuesday, that Immigration's Custom Enforcement did a sweep in Oklahoma and northern Texas. They arrested people who had been involved in human trafficking, involved in larceny, burglary, robbery, sexual exploitation of a minor, right? And so now, because Immigrations and Custom Enforcement did this immigration sweep and arrested all those poor, innocent victims, there's a group of Oklahoma faith leaders who are coming together to hold weekly protests against Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. One of them actually is Representative Colin Walke's wife. It seems to be a leader of this group protesting the removal of, people who committed robbery, larceny, burglary, drug crimes, human trafficking, sexual exploitation of the minor. And I don't know, somebody should ask Colin Walke if he agrees with his wife. Is it just a crying shame that ICE has been removing those people from the streets of Oklahoma? Be curious what he thinks about that. We'll talk more about that tomorrow, and a little more about happiness on the program tomorrow as we wrap up our week here on the Trent England Show. Thanks for watching today, and remember, the whole archive is up at ocpathink.org. That's the website of the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. Find the whole archive there, as well as lots of things that I write and my colleagues, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.